Welcome, everyone, to the AI Risk Reward Podcast. I'm your host, Alec Crawford, and our very special guest today is Jill Fain Lehman, AI research pioneer and senior project scientist at Carnegie Mellon, and recent author of a book called Private Eye, as in the letter I. Welcome, Jill.
Thank you so much, Alex. It's great to be here.
Awesome to have you. So, look, I normally start talking about people's careers, but you and I have been doing computer science since before people knew what they were. And so tell us a little bit about like your first kind of computer you worked on.
Well, the first computer, actually, the first computer that I had any control over was an IBM 360. It was a summer job where I worked for an insurance company and I did batch processing for their receipts. But probably the very first computer was in a cluster at a summer program at Phillips Exeter.
Wow.
And that's where I learned to program. I went there because I thought I was going to be an architect. And they had a summer school where you could take an architecture class and you had to take 3 classes. And I thought, okay, well, there's a basic programming course. Sure, I'll do that because why not? And then that's 2 things where I have to, think hard. So I'll take ceramics. And by the end of that summer, I knew I did not want to be an architect. And I immediately turned around and enrolled in both computer courses that my high school offered. And
Amazing.
look back.
Amazing that they had computer classes back then. Like I'm trying to think, like I don't think my high school had any computer classes. I taught myself basic when I was 13, but you know.
Okay, but here's the great thing. Are you ready for this? The 2 languages I did in high school, COBOL
Mm.
and Fortran.
Ooh, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Which actually makes me an incredibly valuable resource since there's an enormous amount of legacy software outrunning this country right now that's implemented in COBOL, and fewer people who actually know how to program.
Yeah.
Not that I think I remember, but
Yeah. Yeah, I remember some Fortran when I was at my first bank job. I never learned COBOL, but I know lots of archaic things like Lisp and Scheme and things like
yeah.
that. But and how did you first become interested in AI? It's a long gap between like, hey, I'm going to learn BASIC and AI, right?
Not really. I knew that I wanted to do computer science, and at the same time I'd always been interested in language. I'd
Hmm.
always been interested in cognitive psychology, and I just happened to be lucky enough to hit college at a time when the intersection of those 3 things was just getting exciting, right? When
Yeah.
cognitive science was just becoming a thing. I was lucky enough to go to Yale, where Roger Schank was, and Robert Sternberg and Bob Abelson, and the pioneers and all of that. And it was just a perfect fit for what I was interested in. And the summer before I think it was the summer before I went, I'm pretty sure, um, Joseph Weizenbaum's book came out, where he talked about Eliza. And really, it was reading that. I didn't know that I was going to do AI. I knew what I was interested in, but I read that book, and the idea that people could talk to, you know, type to a computer interface, know it was a computer, and treat it as if there was a real mind back there, what just floored me, especially once you understood, because one of the first things we did in AI as undergraduates was we built our own version of this, right?
Yeah.
Um, and it was just amazing to me that was possible.
Super cool. Any other insights from your time at Yale studying computer science, psychology?
Uh, just it's I think it's especially valuable now because we're back in the Eliza world, in the sense that even more so than in those days, the ability to interact with something that makes you feel as if there's a human behind it uh, has never been stronger. And I can come at, and in the book, of course, a lot of what informs the book, or the ideas that we're trying to get across in the book, uh, is about trying to help people think about, in a really accessible way, how do you keep that front of mind? How do you keep the distinction between a piece of software and a human being in front of mind when you can get caught up in the interaction, and when you can get all of the signals, all of the cues that we're used to being able to get from other people? And I think, having been at the intersection of cognitive psychology and computer science for so long, I've never strayed, and always done work in natural language processing and machine learning, always. I've never sort of strayed very far from that question that I began with. And so I have a lot of opinions about it, a lot of
Wow.
thoughts about it.
Super cool. So what a lot of people don't realize is that, AI really started in the 1950s and
Yep.
went kind of through a golden age in the 80s and the AI winter in the 90s. And obviously it's back with a vengeance, right?
Hmm.
So talk a little bit about, I mean, most of our audience was obviously not around for, the breakthroughs in the 80s. Like, so talk a little bit about that.
So, you know, there's sort of, the 80s were sort of the very beginning of a lot of the technologies that we don't think too hard about anymore. So early, 80s are things like harpy speech, right? They're things like, and some NLP stuff. And then you get a little further along, you get a little cognitive science, you get more of uh more of sorry about that. Things are dinging in my background. Um, and you move slowly into the expert systems stuff. So, you know, my first experience with, I've always sat partly in academia and partly in industry. But my first real experience with spinning stuff out uh, was when I was in graduate school, watching stuff get spun out in Pittsburgh, to Carnegie Learning, an education company that I went on uh, to do sort of agent-based tutoring. And this is right. This is back in the late 80s, early 90s. And then I was at Rand, and that was when places like Stanford were starting to spin out their expert systems stuff into the San Francisco area, whether it was in medicine or in hardware or whatever. And so I sort of watched all of that stuff happening. Um, and then die.
Yeah.
Right. And you bring up, not you bring up AI starting in 1950s. So I'm assuming I'm assuming you're talking about 1956 in the Dartmouth conference, where they,
Hmm.
kind of coined that phrase. And the great thing to keep in mind is, and I like to tell this story because of how relevant it is right now, that in 1965, Herb Simon, Nobel laureate, great Carnegie Mellon AI person, Herb Simon basically said, so McCarthy, when he wrote the grant to get the funding for the summer Dartmouth conference, he actually wrote, well, we think that in 3 months or 3 weeks, I don't remember how long the conference was, we think we can pretty much, make real progress on all of these cognitive tasks, all of these intellectual tasks, such that, the field that's been lagging for so long, right? Then, so they do that. And then in 65, Herb Simon says, oh, I predict in, I don't remember if he picked 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years, but it was a short window. We will have systems that can do everything. He didn't call it AGI, but that's what he was saying, a generally intelligent system that could do everything. Minsky did it again 5 years later. So every single time there's sort of any kind of shift, expert systems, unification grammars, whatever it is, every time there's a paradigm shift, there is somebody who is going to say loud, long, and often that whatever they're calling it in the moment, in this moment it's AGI, but it's always something, is just a few years away. So I've been listening to this for a really long time now. And it's part of the reason we set private eye 20 years from today, because usually the estimate is about 20 years. I mean, if you sort of look over time, because it's a generation, you want to say within a generation. So you say 20 years. And so we picked 20 years for that reason, because we wanted to say, this isn't going to stop, right? The field isn't going to stop, and no AGI isn't going to happen tomorrow, but we're going to keep moving along this path. So let's talk about the next time people are saying, this is it, and it's here, or it's just a few moments away.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And look, I think what a lot of people don't understand is that large language models are basically statistical models, right? They're predicting the next token or word basically based on what you've already written. There's obviously it's an element of randomness there, a stochastic element that, otherwise you get the same answer all the time, all that good stuff. They're not conscious. They will never be conscious, right?
No.
Like they're statistical tools. Now, maybe in the future, some combination of different things, creates AGI. It's not going to be LLMs by themselves. And one of my personal predictions is that in 10 years, we'll still have LLMs, but we'll have something else, whatever that is, it's better. And I don't know what that is. Is that something to do with quantum computing? Is it something else? I have no idea.
Well, if somebody wants to give you the money, I can build Marlowe. I know how to build Marlowe. Or
Ooh,
I think
cool.
I know how to build Marlowe.
That's pretty cool.
and really, it's not. So you mentioned consciousness, and I just want to push back on that just a little bit, because that's a separable question.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
From what AGI is supposed
AGI and consciousness are different. Yep.
And it's important because there is a question of how important is that to you, right? Is it okay if you have something that is as smart as a human being, whatever that means, as intelligent as general intelligence, and doesn't have this thing we call consciousness? Or do you actually believe that you can't have that without consciousness? These are not done deals yet, right?
Right. And hey, so how does your novel Private Eye reflect your views on machine consciousness?
So I want to make sure that I mention that the novel has 3 authors: Ashley Watson, myself, and Paul Pangara, who's a colleague of mine at Carnegie Mellon. Paul's background is in cybernetics, which is interesting because he and I come at a lot of questions collaboratively, but from different paradigms, from different points of view. Ashley was and is a novelist, a writer who has the tech background of sort of an average adult, which is to say not somebody who was very technically sophisticated or exposed to much beyond Word documents and Excel sheets and, all the things that most adults use if you live in this country. And so she was, neither Paul nor myself have any experience writing fiction. And so it was a collaboration where the intent was to have somebody who knew how to write fiction and tell a good story, right? Weave together the things that we wanted to say. And one of the main questions, one of the main issues that arose very early on in this collaboration was, Ashley wanted me to say whether Marlowe was conscious. She didn't want to leave that up in the air. And it took a lot of convincing, in my memory at least, it took a lot of convincing to make her understand that one of the most fundamental things I wanted to do in the book was not answer that question.
Oh,
and
super cool.
I wanted to put Marlowe and Paloma's the human, Marlowe and Paloma in a series of situations where you got to see from first person or 2-person internal monologue what their relationship was and what each of them brought to this constant conversation. And I wanted to explore that from as technically plausible a point of view as I could, but at the same time, never answer that question explicitly, because I want the reader to decide does Marlowe cross that line? What do I need to see in terms of behavior? What do I need to know in terms of what the underlying technical model looks like, or technical commitments look like? And it's not, we call it a beach read for nerds. It's not like you're going to get a lot of technical stuff, but there is a little bit. And more importantly, um, anything that is technical is something that I wrote. So don't blame
Mm.
Ashley.
Hmm.
If you disagree with it, you're disagreeing with me, and that's fine. But I'm willing to defend what little technical detail there is in the book as being a step forward. And so there is a lot here that is very different from large language models. And one of the things we're doing in the sequel, which ties up the story of Paloma and Marlowe, is we're exploring sort of what the possible relationships are between humans and AIs within society as a whole. So we establish two of those kinds of relationship, and we contrast them in Private Eye. And then in the second book, in the sequel, we look at two other cells in the squares in the matrix, for how this thing could play out. And the idea is really very much to give people an accessible way to think about that, so that they might make some decisions before those decisions are made for them.
Yeah.
Um,
So it's funny, we're talking earlier, and I was saying, hey, I started the Harvard Science Fiction Association with my friend Carl English. And so I've been reading and looking at this stuff for a super long time. And I think, a lot of times science fiction does become reality and helps people think about, futures they do and do not want. Super interesting statistic, but people in Japan are way more positive about AI than in the US. And a lot of it is because the TV shows and cartoons in Japan show AI as helpful most of the time. And here it's all like the Terminator movies and AI taking over the world and bad things. So that doesn't have to happen, but we kind of do need to choose our path here as a society too.
yep.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts on the current trajectory of AI development? So this could be part of your story or not part of your story. I'm
Yeah.
just curious, like what comes after LLMs? What's your prediction?
So it's funny because when we finished Private Eye, we finished, we went through early readers, we did revisions, blah, blah, blah. We finished it, and a month later, ChatGPT dropped. The world changed out from underneath us. Our readership changed out from underneath us. We thought really hard about whether to scrap it, to try to rewrite it, given where things were. And one of the conversations we did not, by the way, all we did was add, I don't know if you noticed in your copy, on the copyright page, there's the only thing we really did that was substantive was add to the copyright page a note that said no part of this book was written by AI,
Yeah.
or we didn't use AI in
And
order,
and and
in
please
any
don't feed it
aspect.
to AI either. Yeah.
Well, that too. Um,
I
but
did read that page.
yeah. um, but it's been the most fun thing is this. We made predictions, and I now have probably 500 or 600 bookmarks since we put it up on Amazon. 500 or 600 articles bookmarked in New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Wired, Verge, TechCrunch. All the popular press, media and Medium articles. People who are in tech who write for Medium, or other Substack or whatever. So watching the stepping stones. So every time something comes out, like I'm trying to think what the most recent one was. It was some change in the technology. It was in an ACM newsletter. It was some change that they could now basically run a computer on an ear thing, like right on an ear cuff. Well, that's where Marlowe sits. Marlowe sits on ear cuff.
Yeah.
So it's a change in um, uh, in the underlying hardware, right? Which has to happen for Marlowe to be there in 2045. And one of the things you'll find out, a little teaser, one of the things you'll find out in the sequel is that the first form factor for Marlowe was actually in glasses. So as soon as Meta had, now remember, we already established that. We talk about it more. And so when Meta comes out with these glasses that are now first person point of view, again, that's exactly how, if you put glasses on a 4-year-old and you get that first person point of view, and you can afford to run 24 hours a day, and you can do all the other things that go into Marlowe. So these are stepping stones, and watching the world unfold toward this speculative future is wonderfully fascinating. At the same time, I think there's a lot of other things that are not wonderfully fascinating. One of the literary conceits in that world, in the world of the book, is this idea of the shorthand called MISIDA, the Machine Intelligence Self-Identification Act. It's a really important, strong part of that world. And it is a reaction. We don't say exactly when it gets passed, but it is a reaction to privacy violations. It is a reaction to exactly what is happening now, which is this idea that absent an act like one that says, if you are an autonomous agent, AI, if you are an autonomous AI, you must identify yourself as such, and you must get permission from a human being before you can interact. And to not do that is actually illegal. Doesn't mean there isn't illegal activity. Obviously, there will always be illegal activity, but there is a moment when this act is passed where people have decided that this is important, that knowing and having the choice to get certain kinds of information, to have certain kinds of interactions with human beings is important enough for us to require that socially and legally and politically and everything else. And so I look at a lot of what's going on, and my fingers are crossed that that becomes true, because I think the situation that we're in now, in which it is not true, is already proving itself to be problematic and will continue to be problematic. And increasingly so until we have at least that simple, straightforward, it's not a 900-page, we're going to try to anticipate every single thing, right?
Yeah.
No, it's just a statement. It's like a human rights statement. Humans have the right to know whether they're talking to a human being, and they have the right to talk to a human being.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
That makes sense.
I'd sort of be okay with that. If you wanted to add that to the Bill of Rights, I'd be okay with that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think a lot about AI ethics. I sit on the executive board of the Global AI Ethics Institute. I think a lot about it in, my role running an AI company in terms of, what kind of future do we want to see? And I'm very concerned about AI ethics and privacy. And just there's a lot of stuff getting kind of thrown out the window right now because a lot of companies and governments are trying to do things as fast as they can at AI.
Fast as they can. Yep.
Yeah, and then kind of, oh yeah, we'll worry about this other stuff later, right? Not a great plan. Like,
well, as fast as they can, and with a very minimally examined and minimally expressed notion of what the actual limitations of the current technology are.
exactly.
Yeah.
And look, if you're picking your favorite ice cream flavor or what color to paint a room with AI, whatever, but if you're, granting loans or getting medical advice, like totally different story. And I know plenty of people I've run into like, oh, I checked my symptoms on ChatGPT. I'm like, that's not a good idea. Right?
So the general rule that I use, and that in other kinds of interviews and writing that I've done, my general view is this: nothing about current models are experiential. They don't have experience, right? As you said earlier, They're stochastic models. They're just, I don't mean just in that that's trivial. It's not trivial. There's a lot about language that really is statistical, but meaning isn't one of those things. Meaning is grounded in people's experience. And so I ask myself, before using one of these, before using an LLM, or in looking at the ways other people are using them who ask me, should I use it for this or shouldn't I use it for that? Or how do you think it should be used? My general rule is pretty simple. If you were having the conversation with a human being, would you want that human being to be relying on their experience? Is your trust in what you get back from as a response because you believe that you share experience? If that's a factor in you trusting the response, don't get the response from anything other than a human being currently. Now, if you have Marlowe in 20 years, will that be enough? I don't know. That's for you to decide. But for right now, if you want to be able to trust it, if when you talk to a person, it matters to you whether you trust that person or not, you shouldn't be talking to an AI for it.
Yeah, I totally agree. So, look, how do you think storytelling, and let's wrap this into your book as well, can help shape public understanding of AI and its implications? So, you've obviously doing this in your book, but let's think about it more broadly.
Look, I think that I love language. I've spent my entire professional career moving from place to place, project to project, group to group, any and everything that I could do that was related to language, because I just think for your listeners who are technical people, who are computer scientists, I think language is AI complete. I think it is the hardest problem. If you can solve the problem of language, and that includes meaning, that's as hard as every other problem. And what we as a species do with language, I find unbelievable. I think language is the coolest thing there is. And for as long as pretty much as long as we've had it, what we've done with it is tell stories. Telling stories is a way that allows us to root a new idea in experience and give a person more, right? When you understand what I say, you do that because you see the shared part of our experience, and that's really important. But you also see what's new, and that's really important because you get to build on that experience that you have without taking the time to go and have the experience. Language has this fantastic property that it allows us to trade stuff back and forth. And so I think language is exactly the way that we get people to tell themselves these stories, to put them in what if scenarios, to say, identify if we've done our job well. Every 20-year-old woman, 19-year-old woman out there, and every woman who was 19, and hopefully all the men too, who might not have been 19-year-old women but can abstract, will say to themselves, what would I have done if I had had this? What does that mean? Wow, what would it be like if I had this voice talking to me and telling me the things, and it was life or death, and somebody was chasing me and there were dead bodies in the room, we put you in mundane circumstances, put you in exceptional circumstances. But really, it's about what if it was me? And closing your eyes and doing what uh archive of our own people do, right? Buy into the world and start to explore it for yourself. And I think you have to give people a toehold. And you give people a toehold through storytelling. And you give people a toehold through making it easy to enter the world.
Yeah. Well, that reminds me of Saving Private Ryan, one of my favorite movies, where at the end of the movie you figure out, oh, the person watching the movie is Ryan,
Right.
right? As Private Ryan, right? So that's very interesting. So switching gears to our advice section, what
Mhm.
advice would you give to young researchers entering the field of AI today?
Oh, well, okay. So I'm going to show my age in this one. Um, I still do research. I work a lot with graduate students. I work occasionally with undergraduates, but mostly I work with graduate students. Um, and the thing that I think I would tell anyone who is thinking about a career in computer science, but specifically in AI, is this is not that new.
Yeah,
Um, the words that are being used are lazy words. This isn't
yeah.
thinking. This isn't reasoning. I object. I give guest lectures in a local high school. And one of the very first things when I was asked a year and a half ago to give the first one, I rather publicly said to the two teachers of the course, this was a machine learning course, please stop using the word hallucination. The word hallucination implies that it is doing something different when it gives an error or a wrong answer than it is when it gives what you believe is a right answer. It's not. It's all the same processing. But
Mhm.
by anthropomorphizing in that way, by using the language that Sam Altman and others want you to use, you um, you create an illusion that we are suddenly someplace that is unique and unlike anything we've ever seen before. And I have news for you. All of the stuff that's going on, we've seen before. You get a paradigm shift. Everybody decides it's good for everything, especially if it's something as broad as a language model, or as broad as a foundation model, or a vision model, or combined language vision model, or an end to end foundation model, whatever, right? And it can do great, new, interesting things. And so there will be the people who tell you it can do everything, and we're there. We've seen this over and over and over again. And then what happens next is the use cases. It narrows, and you find out, well, actually, for genomics, this really does make a huge difference because the theory that underlies the meaning of those symbols is well specified. It's not out in the world being lived and expanded every day. It's a theory, and you can get your hands on it. And the tokens that go with that theory are something that you can search over and find out new things. And that's fantastic, right? And so what will happen is there will be the use cases, and they will not be general intelligence. And some of them will have economic impact, and some of them won't. And then there will be the pushback, and there will be the people who abuse the technology, and then there will be more pushback. And like I said, we've been here before. So my best advice to you is go learn your history. Learn the history of the field. Learn the history of the ideas, because the paradigm is different. The math is different. But the idea of what problems you can solve are established by the field of AI, and those problems have been around for a long time. And understanding how this solution is better and how this solution isn't as good or is as bad as previous solutions will do you a whole lot of good in surfing the curve, because what goes up does come down. And
Yep. Gartner calls it the hype cycle.
yep,
We're definitely
this is the
woo.
yep, this is the third one I've lived through in my AI life, but the first one was as a student. This is the second one I've lived through as a non-student, and they're pretty much the same.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So switching gears in the advice section to thinking about a CEO of a really big technology company that will remain unspecified, and you
mhm.
get to give that person really good advice about, what we should be doing with AI and things that you're concerned about going forward. Right? What's that advice that you're going to whisper in that person's ear?
I'm not sure that that person wants to hear it.
Too bad.
Um,
Too bad.
um, I think my advice is this. If you want to advocate for the chance to keep building, to keep moving toward the goal of finding out what can we do um, in the interaction between humans and machines, accept that the underlying motivation in the business world is different than the underlying motivation in the basic research world of academia. Even industrial research is different. I've worked in both, is different than academic research. And do your best to make sure, as you whisper into the ears of others who are listening to you, do your best to make sure that academia is still a place that research gets done, that research is still funded. Because the long-term goals, the long-term vision, the ability to maintain the perspective from the past, and to pass that knowledge on so that we're not just recreating the wheel over and over and over again in a new guise. That happens in academia. It doesn't happen in industry. And right now, things are very imbalanced about where research is getting done and whether it is a short-term view and a short-term reward versus the next set of real changes, the next set of real ideas that take basic science, that take and require that you don't have to make money, but that you can stand back and say, let's be systematic and understand what was good and what was bad, and where we succeeded and where it fails. And then let's characterize it for others so that others can build on it. And let's be transparent and open about all of it and all of that kind of stuff. That's how things move forward when the crash inevitably happens. And if there's no one to do that work, ultimately, I don't think that serves anybody's best interests.
Great advice. So our last section is a lightning round where I mention things and you tell the audience whether you think they're underrated or overrated or maybe even fairly rated, or you can pass if they're things you don't really know about. So we'll kick it off with the Yale Bowl as a place to watch football, underrated or overrated.
Well, that's I don't think it can be overrated. I mean, I think it's just, particularly, on the day of the game, uh, it's the only place to be, period. And so much better when one watches it at Yale.
Now I noticed that you're wearing red and I'm wearing blue, so we're
Yeah,
wearing
this is pretty funny, right?
the wrong colors on
Yeah,
this podcast, but that's
yeah.
okay. How about hiking trails near Pittsburgh, underrated or overrated?
Probably underrated. We have terrific. We have great hiking. We have great hiking 2 blocks away from my house.
Amazing.
Um, and then if you want to get out of the city, and that's in the city, Frick Park is in, and it's not just great hiking like, oh yeah, yeah, it's a park. I mean, like down into the ravine where the train tracks are and back up the other side. And it's I live in Squirrel Hill and the hill part is there for a reason. So you want to work out or you want to just get away from the noise of cars. It's beautiful, so many choices. And then once you get outside of the city, it's even more amazing. The parks that we have close by, and to go walk again in the city, to go walk along the point, where the Three Rivers meet and the Ohio starts. It's
That's
great.
awesome. Way better than New Haven is what you're saying. That's great.
Yeah,
Uh,
sorry. It
Isaac,
is. But I would say I've lived in Boston too, just for a
all right,
summer job.
all right.
And of all the places I've lived in Los Angeles and Rhode Island and Boston and Washington, D.C. I really think Pittsburgh is just one of the best places I've ever lived.
Wow. That's an endorsement. Isaac Asimov's Three Rules for Robots. Underrated or overrated?
I think they're rated about right. I think This kind of goes with my learn the history of your field. I think it's really important to know them and to have thought them through. And if you're going to tell stories and if you're going to try and push people to think and imagine, I think you want to be different, and we are. But I think you want to be different against that backdrop because it's an important backdrop. It's an important starting point.
Great. Reading other science fiction authors for fun, besides yourself, obviously. Underrated or overrated?
Wow, there's so much variation, so much variability. I love it. So again, hard for me to say overrated. Um, but I grew up on classics like Frank Herbert and Heinlein, and some of which the modern aesthetic probably would have strong reactions to. Heinlein in particular, I think would be a little bit harder to sell some of his stuff. But I think Herbert has aged very well.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it depends who you read. Stephenson is great. I love Neil Stephenson. And I think there are a lot of fabulous authors out there. So I just think people should just read and find the time to read, and read my book, or our book, read Private Eye. But, read the competition too. It's okay.
Read, and more reading.
Yep.
The Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, underrated or overrated?
I think rated about right. He's a local son, and I'm in favor of giving him space in the museum environment. We have an incredibly, thanks to Andrew Carnegie, who was, quite the philanthropist in addition to being quite the robber baron. We have a wonderful, just incredible public library system and museum system, and the Warhol is part of that. I find his aesthetic to be fun, and I'm glad that I was exposed to it, but tiresome after a while. A lot of repetition. I want more variety than that.
Yeah.
That's me.
It's a whole museum full of Andy Warhol. Yeah.
Yeah.
How many times a year are you going to go? That's a good point. Herbert Simon as an AI pioneer, underrated or overrated?
Oh, well. So that's a hard one. My Alan Newell, his collaborator, was on my thesis committee. I postdoced with Alan, and unfortunately, when Alan got cancer, I took over his research project. So I have a certain amount of both delight about her because that was such a rich relationship, but I also have a certain how do I say this? A certain need to push Alan's name out there
Sure.
more.
Yeah.
Because I think if you were to, they were collaborators. They
Yeah.
were they worked so much of what Herb contributed. He contributed in the context of working with Alan.
Yeah.
And so it was Alan who did the bulk, I think, of moving forward, and certainly of, despite the fact that Herb eventually sat in the psychology department, cognitive architecture was very much Alan, much more so than Herb. And since that's where my heart is, I always feel like Alan gets a little short shrifted. And thank you for the opportunity to talk him up a little.
Yoga retreats, underrated or overrated?
Well, I've never been on one, but I practice yoga regularly. I'm a big fan of yoga. So I don't know how they're rated, but I don't think they could be overrated.
There we go. Agatha Christie mystery novels, underrated or overrated?
Not possible to overrate Agatha Christie. She is hands down. Like, so, like, are you spying on me? I feel like you have been reading somehow. My TV has been
I
sending you.
do. I do deep research. Deep
I
research.
seriously, I mean, Agatha Christie, my absolute favorite mystery writer ever. Classic, classic, classic. If
Yeah.
you've never read, audience, if you've never read an Agatha Christie, go and read them because everybody else copies. Now, Private Eye is more thriller. I mean, there is a mystery, but it's more thriller. And so it's really more, and it's very noir. That's the whole genre is noir. So I would say we're a bit more Raymond Chandler than Agatha Christie. But I think and read the best of them. Read
Yeah.
And Then There Were None, and
Right.
the real classics that
I,
established her.
I grew up reading them, taking them off my grandmother's bookshelf and reading them. It was
Yep.
awesome. And last but not least, the movie When Harry Met Sally, underrated or overrated?
Okay, now I get to tell you this story. I swear to God, this is like the most bizarre thing that you just asked me this question. Synchronicity is a weird thing, right? So, you know what happened at the Super Bowl with the remake of with Billy Crystal and Meg Ryan, the
Mm-hmm.
remake in
Yep.
Katz's Diner.
Yep.
So my husband just went to a lecture by a guy who wrote a book called, I think it's called Pastrami and Rye.
Mm-hmm.
Apologies to the author if I got that wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a night that was hosted with basically takeout from Katz's Diner, or flown in from Katz's Diner since it was in Pittsburgh.
Mm-hmm.
And as part of it, the author of the book was in the lecture that he was giving, talks about this scene in the original movie and about the scene in I guess in the Super Bowl, the remake of the scene in the Super Bowl. And then he shows a video that's out on YouTube. I think it's out on YouTube. I'm pretty sure it's out on YouTube because my
Everything's on
husband
YouTube.
came home and showed it to me, which is at Katz's Diner. There's a sign on the ceiling that says, "This is the reenactment of Harry Met Sally's Zone."
Wow.
And apparently this was done by like a theater group of a local one of the universities in the city, so that two people are sitting there, they're sitting under the sign, and they start playing the scene out, and everyone's sort of rolling their eyes because there's a sign and everything. But then all over Katz's Diner, other women start doing Meg Ryan's part, like at every fifth table. Okay. And the wait staff didn't know that this was a loaded audience or this was a loaded clientele. And the wait staff are looking at each other like, oh my God, what is going on? And the people who are not in on it are looking at each other like, what is going on? And the wildest thing about this is what, 5-minute video, 6-minute video, somewhere around minute 3, a former colleague of mine from Carnegie Mellon's face fills the screen, and she's looking around like, what is going on? She is the one who her name is Bonnie John, and she used to be a professor at Carnegie Mellon. She was part of the SOAR project with me and Alan Newell. I'm telling you, synchronicity is a weird thing, okay? And she is the one who stands up at the end and says, I'll have what they're having.
Oh my God. That
Yes,
is
I'm telling you,
crazy.
it's like the most unbelievable thing that you would ask this question. So, much like the Yale Bowl and Agatha Christie, I'm going to go for can't oversell.
Not possible.
Not possible.
Anyway, awesome. Well, this is Jill Fain Lehman, AI research pioneer and senior project scientist at Carnegie Mellon, and author or one of the 3 authors of the book Private Eye. You can look at the
Available
show
on
notes
Amazon.
for that and on Amazon. Jill, thanks for coming on the show. This has been a blast.
Thank you. I've had a great time. Bye-bye.
All right.